He slid the document across the table like it was nothing, like it was a lease agreement, a grocery receipt, something a person signs and forgets. Kang Min-jae didn't look up. He was already checking his phone, thumb moving slow and deliberate across the screen, while his secretary Seo Hyerin stood 3 feet behind him, with her hands folded and her face arranged into that expression she always wore, patient, professional, completely empty of anything human. The pen sat on top of the papers, waiting. Nia Okafor had been married to this man for 4 years. She knew what his silence meant when it was gentle, and what it meant when it had edges. This silence had edges. "What is this?" she asked. Minji finally looked up. "Estate planning," he said. "We've talked about this." They hadn't. Not like this. Not with a stack of documents 3 inches thick, and a secretary present, and that particular flatness behind his eyes that she'd learned to read the way you learn to read weather. Not because you want to, but because you have to. She didn't reach for the pen. If you've ever stood in a room and felt the floor shift beneath you, not from an earthquake, not from anything you can name, but from the sudden, certain knowledge that something is deeply wrong, then you already know what Nia felt in that moment. That cold drop in the chest, that animal instinct that says, don't move, don't sign, don't trust this. She didn't know yet how right that instinct was. She didn't know that in less than 72 hours, she would be standing in a parking garage with a phone in her hand and a recording that would change everything, a recording that would expose the man she loved, the empire he'd built, and the plot to make sure she never walked out of it alive. She didn't know any of that yet. All she knew, in that moment, was that she was holding the most important secret of her life, a grainy black and white ultrasound image folded inside her coat pocket, pressed against her ribs like something she needed to protect. And that the man sitting across from her was not the man she thought she'd married. If you were her, what would you do? If everything you believed about your life turned out to be a lie carefully constructed around you, what would you do with the truth? Stay with us. Because Nia Okafor is about to show you exactly how a woman survives when the walls close in. And she does it not with rage, not with tears, but with something far more dangerous. Before we go further, if you're watching this for the first time, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a like if you're already feeling this, and tell us in the comments, what city or country are you watching from right now? We want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it really begins. The morning had started with the best news of Nia's life. She'd been sitting in the examination room at Seoul National University Hospital for 40 minutes before Dr. Lim came in. And those 40 minutes had been the particular kind of quiet that sits on top of panic, the quiet of someone who has trained herself, through repetition and grief, not to hope too hard. Nia knew that room. She'd sat in rooms like it before. She knew the sound the paper makes on the examination table, the way the ultrasound machine hums, the exact angle of fluorescent light that makes everything look clinical and cold. She'd had 3 miscarriages in 4 years. The first one had been 11 weeks. The second at 9. The third, the worst, had been 14 weeks along, and by then she had started to believe just a little that it might hold. She'd bought a book. A small one, nothing serious, just a slim volume about what to expect in the second trimester. She'd kept it in her nightstand, under a scarf, because she was afraid of wanting things too much. She threw it away after the third loss. She didn't tell Min-jae how bad it got after that. She didn't tell him about the 3 weeks she spent barely leaving their bedroom, eating almost nothing, staring at a ceiling that felt like it was pressing down. She didn't tell him because he was in Tokyo for most of it, and when he came back he held her and said the right things, and she could feel the effort behind it, the way a person braces to hold weight they find difficult. And she loved him anyway, desperately, in the way that people love what they cannot quite reach. Dr. Lim came in that morning carrying a tablet and wearing an expression that Nia immediately tried not to read. "Mrs. Kang," he sat down. "The results from your blood work and this morning's scan." He paused. Not the kind of pause that precedes bad news. A different kind. The fetal heartbeat is strong. Everything we're seeing is within the healthy range for 8 weeks. Nia didn't react at first. She sat very still, the way a person sits when they're afraid that moving will break something. "The previous losses have been documented and factored into our assessment," Dr. Lim continued, "and based on what we're seeing, there's no indication at this stage of the same complications. I want you to come back in 2 weeks, and we're going to monitor closely, but he looked at her directly. This is good news, Mrs. Kang. This looks good. Nia pressed her lips together hard. She would not cry in this office. She'd made that rule after the second miscarriage, when she'd sobbed so hard in the elevator on the way out that a stranger had put a hand on her shoulder and she'd had to grip the wall to stay upright. She'd promised herself, not here, not until she was somewhere private. She almost made it. She was 3 blocks from the hospital, standing at a crosswalk in the November cold, when her knees went weak and she had to grab the metal post of a street sign with both hands. The ultrasound image was folded in her coat pocket. She pressed her hand flat against it, feeling the paper through the fabric, and stood at that crosswalk through 2 full light cycles while pedestrians flowed around her like water around a stone. 8 weeks. Strong heartbeat. This looks good. She got into the car. She told her driver, a quiet man named Dysik, who had worked for the household for 6 years, and who she trusted in the uncomplicated way you trust people who never ask you anything, that she wanted to go home. Not to her foundation office downtown, not to the lunch she'd canceled, not to any of the careful, structured appointments that filled her calendar. Home. The mansion in Hanamdong, overlooking the Han River, where Min-jae would be working from his private office on the 2nd floor. She was going to tell him. She'd imagined it. Not in elaborate detail, she'd learned not to do that, but she'd let herself picture the moment in rough strokes, walking into his office, watching his face, seeing something real and unguarded break through that composed exterior he wore like a second skin. Min-jae was not a man who cried, and she wasn't expecting tears. She was expecting something better. That particular stillness that overtook him when something mattered deeply, the way his breath would shift and his hands would go quiet, and he'd look at her with an intensity that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. She wanted that. She'd been carrying this secret alone for 40 minutes, and it was already heavier than anything she'd held in years. Dysik pulled up to the mansion at 11:43 in the morning. Nia thanked him, told him she wouldn't need the car again until 3, and went through the front entrance alone. She knew the house staff's schedule. Thursdays were light. The head housekeeper had the morning off, the kitchen staff were between shifts, and the security rotation had a quiet hour between 11 and noon. She didn't want an audience for this. She took off her coat in the entry hall, folded it over her arm with the ultrasound image still inside, and climbed the east staircase toward Min-jae's office. She was 4 feet from the door when she heard voices. She stopped. Not because she was suspicious, not yet. She stopped because she recognized Hyerin's voice, and Hyerin being in Min-jae's private office on a Thursday morning was unusual. Hyerin worked from the executive building across the city. She came to the mansion only when summoned, and when she came, she was meticulous about scheduling, about formality, about the rigid professional theater she performed in Nia's presence. Nia stood in the hallway. The door was not fully closed. She told herself later that she almost kept walking, that she almost knocked, almost pushed the door open, almost walked in with her coat and her ultrasound image, and her news and her shaking hands, and changed the direction of the next 10 minutes entirely. She didn't. What stopped her was the word she heard through the gap in the door. Inheritance. Not a difficult word, not an unusual word in the household of a man who ran a financial empire worth hundreds of millions. But something about the way Min-jae said it, flat, precise, with no emotional texture whatsoever, made Nia go completely still. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door and listened. The Jeju property specifically needs to be included in the transfer documents, Hyerin was saying. Her Korean was crisp and unhurried. If we leave it out, her attorneys will notice the gap. It needs to appear comprehensive. Her attorneys. Nia's attorneys. It will be comprehensive, Min-jae said. I've had 3 separate legal teams review the structure. Once she signs, the Jeju property, the charitable trust holdings, the foundation accounts, all of it transfers within 72 hours. Nia stopped breathing. She was not a naive woman. She had not married Kang Min-jae without understanding exactly who he was. Not the public version, not the charitable foundation gala version, not the version that gave speeches about economic development and shook hands with government ministers. She had looked at the real man and made a choice. She told herself that the darkness in him was something she could exist alongside, something that would never touch her, something that stayed in a different room of his life. She'd been wrong about that. But even standing in that hallway, she wasn't ready for what came next. The foundation is the problem, Hyerin continued. Her name is primary on 7 international accounts. We can't move those funds without her signature on the full dissolution. I know. Min-jae's chair moved. She heard the wheels on the hardwood floor. That's why the documents need to look like standard estate restructuring. She trusts the legal framing if it comes through Park's firm. She signed everything they've brought her without reading it. That landed like a fist. It was true. She had. She'd signed documents from Min-jae's preferred law firm, Park and Associates, 3 times in the past 18 months, because she trusted Min-jae, and she trusted the firm's reputation, and because the paperwork was always explained to her in soothing, professional language that made it sound like protection rather than extraction. She hadn't read the fine print. She hadn't known to. And after the signing, Hyerin asked? There was a pause. Just 2 seconds. Maybe 3. We've discussed this, Min-jae said. I want to hear it confirmed again. Hyerin's voice didn't change. That was what struck Nia later. Not that the words were being said, but that they were being said in the same measured, administrative tone Hyerin used when discussing quarterly projections, the arrangement with Song's people, the timeline. 2 weeks after the signing, Min-jae said, it needs to look like an accident. She has a history of driving that coastal road at night, the Cheju property. It's plausible. Nia's hand went to the wall. The plaster was cold. She pressed her palm flat against it and felt the cold move up through her arm, and she stood there in the hallway of her own home and understood, in the particular crystalline way that people understand things that are too large to fully absorb, that her husband had just described the method by which he intended to have her killed. She did not make a sound. She did not move. She stood with her back against the wall and her coat folded over her arm with the ultrasound image pressed inside it, and she breathed, slowly, silently, the way a person breathes when they cannot afford to fall apart. Inside the office, Hyerin said, She's been emotionally unstable since the last miscarriage. It won't require much explanation. No, Min-jae said. It won't. 3 years of marriage, 4 years of knowing this man. The miscarriages, the grief, the months where the only thing holding her together was the belief that she was at least not doing it alone. All of it rearranged itself in the space of 30 seconds into something she didn't have words for yet. She pushed herself off the wall. She walked back down the hallway, down the east staircase, through the entry hall, out the front door. Dae-sik was still in the driveway. He looked up when she came out. He read something in her face. She saw it. The quick shift in his expression, the professional restraint pulling a mask back into place. And he moved toward the car without being asked. Drive, she said when she was inside. Just drive. Anywhere. He drove. Nia sat in the back seat and looked out the window at Seoul moving past. The river, the bridge, the cold gray sky, and pressed her hand against the ultrasound image through her coat and said nothing for a very long time. She was 8 weeks pregnant. She was married to a man who had just contracted her murder. And she was the only person who knew both of those things. The car moved through the city, and she sat in the back and thought, not in the panicked, scattered way of someone who has lost control, but in the slow, deliberate way of someone who understands that the next decision they make is the most important of their life. She did not reach for her phone. Not yet. She needed to think first. She needed to understand what she had, what she didn't have, and what she was willing to do. Because Min-jae was not a man you moved against carelessly. He had spent decades building an empire precisely because he understood how to eliminate threats before they became dangerous. He did not know yet that she had heard him. He did not know about the baby. And for right now, for this one fragile moment, those 2 facts were the only advantage she had. She pressed her hand harder against the coat. Hold on, she thought. Not to Min-jae. Not to the marriage. Not to any version of the life she'd thought she was living. She was talking to the 8-week heartbeat in her coat pocket. Just hold on. I'm going to figure this out. The car crossed the bridge over the Han River and Seoul spread out on both sides of them in the gray November morning. And Nia Okafor, philanthropist, grieving wife, secret mother, stared out the window and began, very quietly, to build a plan. Dae-sik drove for 40 minutes before Nia told him to stop. Not at the mansion. Not at her foundation office. He pulled over on a quiet side street in Itaewon, a block from a coffee shop she used to go to before she got married, back when she was still just a woman living in Seoul on a philanthropic visa, and the future had not yet taken its current shape. She remembered the place because it had terrible lighting and excellent tea, and the owner never tried to make conversation. "Wait here," she told Dasik. She went inside, ordered something she wouldn't drink, and sat in the back corner with her coat across her lap and the ultrasound image on the table in front of her. She stared at it for a long time. The grainy black and white smear that Dr. Lim had told her represented something with a strong heartbeat, something healthy, something that had, against all reasonable odds, decided to stay. She flipped it face down on the table. She needed to think without looking at it, because looking at it made her hands shake, and she couldn't afford shaking hands right now. She needed to be cold. She needed to be precise. She needed to think the way Min-jae thought, not in feelings, not in grief, but in structure, in exposure and consequence, in what she had and what she still needed. What she had, a conversation she'd overheard. No recording, no documentation. Two voices behind a partially closed door saying things that would end careers and lives, and not a single piece of evidence to prove any of it. What she needed, everything else. She pulled out her phone and sat there for a long moment with it in her hand, thinking about who she could call. Her family was in Lagos. Her closest friend in Seoul, a woman named Amara, was someone Min-jae had introduced her to, someone whose loyalties Nia now had no way of reading with confidence. Her foundation staff reported ultimately to a board whose composition Min-jae had influenced over the years, quietly, the way he influenced everything, through favors and funding and the particular pressure of being the kind of man who didn't need to make explicit threats. She thought about calling her mother. She let herself sit with that impulse for exactly 5 seconds, then put it away. Her mother was 63 years old and lived in Lagos and would get on the first flight to Seoul if Nia said the wrong words. And the last thing Nia needed was someone she loved walking into this city while Min-jae's machinery was still running. She scrolled through her contacts with her thumb moving slowly, deliberately, the way you search through a building for a structural wall, looking for something that will hold weight. She stopped on a name, Han So-young. She'd met attorney Han at a legal reform conference 3 years ago, before the second miscarriage, during a period when Nia had still been actively building the foundation's legal aid partnerships. Han So-young had given a 40-minute address on financial crime prosecution that had been so precise and so relentlessly unsentimental that Nia had sought her out afterward just to shake her hand, and was in her late 40s, small-framed and sharp-eyed, and she had a reputation in Seoul's legal community that people described in one of two ways depending on whether they were afraid of her or grateful to her. They had exchanged cards. They had met twice for coffee in the 18 months that followed. They were not close friends, but they were not strangers either, and more importantly, Han So-young was someone Min-jae had never mentioned, never cultivated, never attempted to bring into his orbit. That mattered. Nia typed a message, short, careful, stripped of anything that could mean something dangerous if read by the wrong person. "I need legal counsel on a personal matter. Time sensitive. Are you available this week?" She sent it before she could think too hard about it. Then she put the phone in her pocket, picked up the ultrasound image, folded it carefully, and placed it back inside her coat. She left the tea untouched. She went back to the car. Han So-young replied 4 hours later, "Tomorrow, 9 a.m., my private office. Come alone." Nia spent that night doing 3 things. She went through every document she had access to in the household filing system, the shared drive Min-jae had given her credentials for years ago, the one she'd barely touched because he always told her the business side was handled, and she'd been too deep in her grief to argue. She went through it slowly, methodically, with a glass of water she kept refilling and a notepad where she wrote nothing incriminating, just page numbers and dates, breadcrumbs she could follow later with someone who knew what they were looking at. The documents were dense, legal language, corporate filing language, the kind of language specifically designed to mean nothing to anyone who wasn't trained to decode it. But she found names that repeated. Shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands, a holding company called Dason Capital that appeared in 4 separate filings and whose ownership structure, when she tried to trace it, dissolved into a series of numbered entities that led nowhere useful. She found her own name 3 times. On documents she had no memory of signing, she stared at those pages for a long time. Then she closed the drive, cleared her search history, and went to bed. She did not sleep. She lay in the bed she shared with Min-jae, who was by then somewhere in the city at a dinner she'd been told was a business engagement. and stared at the ceiling and listened to the apartment breathe around her. The heating system, the distant traffic, the complete absence of any sound that felt safe. The second thing she did was go through her own phone, her personal email, every communication she'd had with Park and Associates in the past 2 years. She found the documents, the ones she'd signed. She read them now, carefully, slowly, with the kind of attention she hadn't given them at the time, and her stomach turned as she understood what she'd been looking at without seeing. Estate restructuring, asset protection, tax efficiency. That was what Park's paralegals had told her. That was the framing, every time, and it had been plausible enough. They were a wealthy household, and wealthy households managed assets carefully, and she had been a woman drowning in grief who trusted her husband to handle the parts of life she couldn't hold right then. She had signed over partial control of 3 charitable trust accounts. She had signed a document that removed her as primary beneficiary from a life insurance policy worth $11 million, replacing her with a corporate entity she now recognized as Daysun Capital. She had signed, 14 months ago, a document that she now understood to be the first layer of the financial architecture being built around her. Not for her. Around her. She put her phone face down on the nightstand and pressed both hands over her face and breathed through her fingers in the dark. The third thing she did was cry. Just once, briefly, for no longer than 4 minutes, because she couldn't help it, and because she was alone, and because even after everything, even now, knowing what she knew, there was still a grief underneath the rage that she hadn't expected. Not grief for the marriage, for the idea of it, for the version of Min-jae she had built in her own mind over 4 years. The one she'd held on to through the miscarriages, and the loneliness, and the long stretches when he was absent, and the world felt thin and breakable. That man had never existed. She'd been in love with a construction, a careful performance maintained by a man who understood exactly how much warmth to offer and when to withdraw it, and how to keep a person perpetually just grateful enough to stop asking questions. She wiped her face. She sat up. She had work to do. Han So-young's private office was on the 14th floor of a building in Seocho that had no signage on the exterior. The elevator required a keycard. The receptionist, a young man who looked like he'd been hired specifically for his ability to appear completely incurious, showed Nia into a conference room and left without offering anything. Han came in 7 minutes later carrying a ceramic mug and wearing reading glasses pushed up on her head. She set the mug down, looked at Nia across the table, and said, "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," Nia said. "Good," Han said and sat down. "People sleep when they feel safe. I'm going to assume you're not here because you feel safe." "No." Han folded her hands on the table. "Tell me." Nia told her. All of it, not in chronological order at first, because the shape of it in her mind was still jagged, and she had to work to straighten it into something communicable. She told Han about the documents she'd signed, the conversation she'd overheard, the shell corporations, the life insurance policy, the name song that Min-jae had used when he talked about the accident. She laid everything out flat on the table, the same way Min-jae had laid that pen and paper in front of her, except that what she was offering was the truth. Han listened without interrupting. She took no notes. Her face gave nothing away, which Nia appreciated more than she could have explained. When Nia finished, Han was quiet for a moment. "You have no recording," Han said. "Not yet." Han looked at her. "Not yet." "I went back to the house last night," Nia said. "I know the layout of his office. I know where his meetings happen. If he brings Hieron back to discuss the next steps, and he will, because that's how he operates. He doesn't use phones for anything sensitive. I can put my phone somewhere he won't check." "That's dangerous," Han said. "I know." "If he finds out you hurt him, you won't have 2 weeks." Han said it flatly, without drama. "You'll have hours." "I know that too." Han picked up her mug, took a slow drink, set it back down. "Show me what you found on the shared drive." Nia slid her phone across the table with the screenshots she'd taken, page numbers, dates, the document naming Daysun Capital as beneficiary. Han put her reading glasses on and went through them without speaking. Her expression shifted once, briefly, when she reached the life insurance document. Something tightened around her mouth. "Daysun Capital," Han said. "You've heard of it?" "Not specifically, but the structure." Han looked up. "This isn't a domestic operation. These registration patterns, the layering through the caimans before it roots back. This is designed to survive scrutiny from Korean financial regulators. Someone with significant international legal infrastructure put this together. She handed the phone back. This took years. Nia felt the words land in her chest. He's been planning this for years. At minimum 2, Han said. Possibly 3. She paused. When did your marriage start to change? Not dramatically. Small things. Subtle. Nia thought about it. She thought about a dinner party 18 months ago where Min-jae had introduced her to a man named Choi without giving his last name, and the way Choi had looked at her, not with attraction but with evaluation, the way you look at something you're trying to calculate the value of. She thought about the way Min-jae had started keeping his private office locked during the day when it had previously been open. She thought about the conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. 3 years ago, she said quietly. Right around when the first miscarriage happened. Han's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. The miscarriages made you vulnerable, she said. Not cruelly, clinically. Emotionally dependent, less likely to ask hard questions, less likely to push back on documents placed in front of you. The words were accurate in a way that felt like being cut with something very sharp and very clean. He used it, Nia said. He used it, Han confirmed. Or someone advised him to, which brings me to Hye-in. She took off her reading glasses, folded them, set them on the table. How long has she worked for him? 6 years. She was there before I came into the picture. And her background? I never looked into it. She was his executive secretary. She was always... Nia stopped. She thought about Hye-in's face in every interaction they'd had. The careful, calibrated distance. The way Hye-in never made a mistake. Never gave Nia anything to work with, never dropped the professional mask by even a millimeter. She was always exactly what she was supposed to be. That's not an accident, Han said. She stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the city. I want to run her name through some databases I have access to. Former employers, financial registration, travel records. Will you give me 48 hours? I don't know if I have 48 hours. You do, Han said. He still needs your signature. He won't move on the other matter until he has it, because the whole architecture collapses without the asset transfer. That signature is the only thing keeping you alive right now. She turned from the window. Don't sign anything. Stall. Tell him you want to review the documents with your own legal counsel. He'll know something's wrong. Then be careful about how you say it. Frame it as your own anxiety, about the miscarriages, about wanting to make sure everything is in order. He thinks you're emotionally fragile. Use that. Nia looked at her. You want me to perform grief to stay alive? Han met her eyes steadily. I want you to use every tool available. Yes. She went back to the mansion that afternoon and found Min-jae in the kitchen doing something she hadn't expected, cooking. He cooked sometimes, rarely, and only when he was in a particular kind of mood. Not relaxed exactly, but settled, confident. Like a man who felt the pieces of his world arranging themselves correctly. That observation made her stomach turn. You're home early, he said. He didn't look up from the pan. I canceled my 3 o'clock, she said. She put her bag down on the counter. She watched his hands. He handled a knife the way he handled everything, without hesitation, like he'd already decided exactly how far to take it. Where were you last night? The dinner ran late. Investors from Tokyo. Jaewon's people. He glanced at her, brief, measuring. You didn't wait up. I was tired. She sat down at the kitchen island, 3 feet from him. She worked to keep her breathing even, her posture loose. Min-jae? Those documents you wanted me to sign, the estate planning. His hands slowed, just slightly. What about them? I've been thinking about it. After... She let herself pause. She let something into her face that was close enough to grief to be readable without being a lie. Because the grief was real, it had just shifted its object. After everything we've been through, the last few years, I want to understand it better before I sign. Can I have my own attorney look at it, just to make me feel better about the language? Min-jae was still for 2 seconds. She counted them. Then he turned back to the pan. Of course, he said, whatever makes you comfortable. The ease of it chilled her more than resistance would have. And called 36 hours later, and her voice was different. Where are you right now? Han asked. In my car. Alone. Seo Hierin. A pause. She's not who she says she is. Nia gripped the phone. Tell me. Her employment and history prior to joining Min Jae's organization is largely fabricated. There are gaps, 2 years between 2014 and 2016, where she essentially doesn't exist in any documented record. But her financial profile tells a different story. She has accounts in 3 countries, registered under variations of her name and 2 aliases. One of those accounts has received wire transfers from an entity called Seojin Holdings. Another pause. Seojin Holdings is a front company. It's been flagged in 2 separate financial crime investigations in the past 4 years. Never prosecuted, because the investigators couldn't get close enough. But the agency that's been building the case is the Financial Intelligence Unit, and the person they believe is running Seojin is a man named Park Yong-chul. Nia didn't know the name. Who is he? The head of a rival syndicate that has been trying to penetrate Min Jae's organization for the past 6 years, Han said. They've been looking for an entry point, someone on the inside. The realization assembled itself in pieces. Hierin. Hierin has been feeding information to Park Yong-chul's people for at minimum 3 years. Everything she knows about Min Jae's operation, his structure, his accounts, his contacts, his vulnerabilities, has been going out the back door. Han's voice was careful, controlled. But here's what matters for you. This isn't just Min Jae moving against you. Hierin has her own agenda, and it aligns with Min Jae's plan only up to the point where you're dead and the assets have moved. After that, he's exposed, Nia said. She gets what she needs and then she uses it. He doesn't know he's being used, Han said. He thinks she's loyal. He's trusted her with everything. A beat. Including you. Nia sat in the back of the parked car and felt the full weight of it settle on her. Not just a husband who wanted her dead. A conspiracy that went further and deeper than she had understood, with competing interests and hidden architecture, and a woman who had spent 6 years playing 2 men against each other, while Nia had been sitting in examination rooms listening to bad news and trying not to hope too much. Can you get this to the Financial Intelligence Unit? Nia asked. I've already made contact with a prosecutor I trust, Han said. But Nia, they need more than what we have. The recording Min Jae and Hierin, if you can get it, it accelerates everything. It's the thread that pulls the whole thing apart. I know, Nia said. I mean it about the danger. Han. Nia's voice came out steady, in a way she hadn't expected. I know. She ended the call. She looked out the window at the street. A woman walked past with a child in a stroller, moving slowly, pointing at something Nia couldn't see. She reached into her coat pocket and pressed her hand flat against the folded ultrasound image. 2 people wanted her dead, for 2 different reasons, and neither of them knew she was sitting on the only evidence that could destroy them both. She had a lawyer, a prosecutor, and a partial paper trail. She had 48 hours before Min Jae would start applying pressure about the documents. She had 1 shot at getting the recording, and if it went wrong, she wouldn't get another. She pulled up the voice memo app on her phone. She looked at the interface for a long moment. The simple red button, the clean display, nothing complicated about it. She thought about the layout of Min Jae's office, the placement of the chairs, the small decorative bowl on the credenza by the east window where Min Jae dropped his keys every morning, a habit so fixed it had become invisible. She could put a phone in that bowl. She could walk into his office on a pretext, she'd done it hundreds of times, and leave it there before she left. She knew his schedule. She knew that Hierin came on Thursday mornings, and that they met with the door pulled almost but not entirely shut. Today was Tuesday. She had until Thursday to position it, and she had to do it without Min Jae noticing, which meant she had to go back to that house and sleep in that bed and eat at that table and hold herself so completely together that a man who had spent decades reading people for a living saw nothing wrong in her face. She straightened her back. She told Dasik to take her home. The car moved through the city, and she sat with her hand pressed against her coat and her jaw set and her eyes dry, and she thought, 2 more days. She told herself that the way you tell yourself anything when the alternative is too large to look at directly. 2 more days of being exactly who he expected her to be. The grieving wife, the trusting woman, the soft and manageable and unremarkable problem that had already been quietly scheduled for resolution. 2 more days, and then she would have something real. She was almost right about the timeline. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known from where she was sitting, was that Min Jae had made a phone call that morning, not on his regular line, On the second phone, the one she'd never seen, the one he kept in the locked drawer of his private office, he'd called Song's people, not to confirm the plan, not to review the timeline, to move it up. Something had shifted in him at the kitchen counter when she'd asked about the documents and her own attorney. And even though his voice had been smooth and his answer had been easy and his hands had kept moving, something behind his eyes had registered a variable he hadn't accounted for. He couldn't name it. He didn't have evidence for it. But Min-jae had survived as long as he had precisely because he'd learned to trust the cold, quiet alarm that went off when something felt even slightly wrong. He'd called Song's people and told them to be ready to move within the week, not 2 weeks after the signing. The week. Nia didn't know this yet. She was riding through Seoul, pressing her hand against the coat, telling herself she had until Thursday. She had less than that now, and the clock had already started. And the only thing standing between her and the version of events Min-jae had decided on was the recording she hadn't made yet, and the baby she hadn't told anyone about, and the stubborn, unbroken part of her that had survived 3 losses and was absolutely not, going to let this be the 4th. The drive back to the mansion took 22 minutes. Nia counted them. Not because she was tracking time in any useful way, but because counting gave her something to do with the part of her brain that wanted to spiral. 22 minutes of Seoul moving past the window, the bridge, the flyover, the familiar turn into Hanam-dong, where the trees were bare and the streets were quiet in the particular way of wealthy neighborhoods, where even the silence felt maintained. She watched all of it like a woman watching a film she's already seen, knowing how it ends, waiting for the part where everything breaks. Dae-sik pulled up to the gate. The security panel blinked green. The gate opened. She had 2 days to get the recording. She walked into the house like she always walked into the house. Coat on her arm, bag over her shoulder, the particular posture of a woman returning from an ordinary afternoon. The entry hall was empty. The kitchen was clean. Someone had cleared away the remains of whatever Min-jae had been cooking, and the house had that polished, airless quality it always had when the staff had passed through, and the surfaces had been wiped and everything had been returned to the version of itself that was meant to be seen. Min-jae was in his office. She could see the light under the door from the top of the stairs. She went to the bedroom instead, changed her clothes, sat on the edge of the bed for a moment with her hands flat on her knees and her eyes on the floor, and ran through it one more time, the bowl on the credenza by the east window, the phone in voice memo mode, the timing. She would go in tomorrow morning on a pretext, something simple. Ask about a dinner they had scheduled for the weekend, a question she could frame as requiring his input. She'd done it before. It would take 30 seconds. She would set the phone down in the bowl the way she sometimes set things down in that office, casually, without emphasis, and walk out. She could do this. She needed to believe she could do this. She went downstairs for dinner. Min-jae was already at the table, a glass of wine poured, his phone face down beside his plate. He looked up when she sat down, and for a moment she looked directly at him, at the face she'd memorized over 4 years, the particular geometry of it, the way he held himself, and felt nothing she recognized. That was new. "You were quiet today," he said. "I was tired." She unfolded her napkin. "I think I'm fighting something." He looked at her for a second longer than necessary, then picked up his wine. "Sleep early," he said. "You've been running yourself down." She ate. She made the appropriate responses. She let him talk about the Tokyo investors for 12 minutes without registering a single word. And when dinner was over, she said goodnight at 9:15 and went back upstairs and lay in the dark with her eyes open until she heard his office door close at 11:30. She slept 4 hours. Maybe 5. She was at the kitchen island with coffee before 7. The plan broke apart at 9:43 the next morning. She'd timed it. She knew Min-jae's first call of the day started at 9:30, a standing conference with the Tokyo office that ran between 30 and 45 minutes. She'd heard it enough times to know the rhythm, the point in the call when his voice shifted from presentation mode into the back and forth of negotiation. She knew that during this call, he never left his desk. He sat with his back to the door and his phone on speaker and his attention locked forward. She went in at 9:40 with a phone in her coat pocket, voice memo already running, and a question about the Saturday dinner already formed in her mouth. She pushed the door open. Yerin was already there. Not Thursday. Wednesday morning, unscheduled, standing at the window with her arms crossed, and a file folder on the desk between her and the empty chair. And Minjai's conference call was not happening because Minjai was not on the phone. He was standing at the credenza by the east window, the one with the decorative bowl, and he turned when Nia opened the door and his face was completely composed and gave her nothing. "Nia," he said. Like she'd knocked, like she'd announced herself, like her walking into her own husband's office at 9:40 in the morning was something requiring acknowledgement. She held the door frame with one hand. Her phone was in her coat pocket with the memo running, but the phone was not in the bowl, and she was standing 3 feet from Hierin, and whatever was in that file folder on the desk was something neither of them had expected her to see. "I'm sorry," Nia said. "I didn't know you had a meeting." "It's all right." Minjay moved from the credenza toward his desk in 2 unhurried steps, putting himself between Nia and the file folder without appearing to do so. "Hierin had something urgent. We were just finishing." Hierin had not moved. She was watching Nia with those level, unreadable eyes, and Nia had a sudden, vivid understanding of what it felt like to be assessed as a problem. Not a person, not a wife, not even an obstacle, just a variable that needed to be managed back out of the room. "The Saturday dinner," Nia said. "I just wanted to ask about the guest list. The caterer needs a final count." 7, Minjai said. He didn't look at anything when he said it. He looked at her. "Same as last time." "Okay." She smiled. She turned and pulled the door closed behind her. She walked down the hallway, down the staircase, into the kitchen. She set both hands on the island counter and stood there with her coffee gone cold beside her and her phone still recording in her pocket, capturing the sound of her own breathing and the hum of the refrigerator and nothing else. Hierin was there a day early, unscheduled, with a file folder. Minjay had moved to place himself between her and the desk. She stood at the kitchen counter and thought about that for 60 seconds with the precision of someone doing math. Then she took her phone out and stopped the recording and looked at the empty audio file, 4 minutes and 20 seconds of nothing useful, and felt the first real crack move through the composure she'd been holding for 3 days. She could not go back in there, not today. If she came back a second time for any reason, he would notice. He was already noticing. She'd seen it in his face when she opened the door. That 2-second recalibration, the slight tightening at the corner of one eye that she'd learned to read as calculation rather than surprise. She needed another approach. She needed it in the next 24 hours. She picked up her phone and called Han. Han's voice was tight from the first word. "Have you seen the news this morning?" Nia hadn't. "What news?" "There was an incident last night, a fire at a warehouse in Incheon. 2 people dead. The property is registered to a company called Mirayan Logistics." Han paused. "Mirayan Logistics is one of the shell entities in Minjai's network. One of the ones I flagged in the document trail." Nia went very still. "You think he knows you're looking?" "I think someone knows someone is looking," Han said. "The fire was too clean. The accelerant pattern, they're not calling it arson yet, but the investigator I spoke to this morning used the word deliberate without being asked." Another pause, shorter. "Nia, I need you to listen to me carefully. The prosecutor I contacted, Lee Jin-ho, Financial Intelligence Unit, he wants to move faster than I thought. He's been building a case on Minjay's organization for 14 months. What we brought him accelerated his timeline. He wants to talk to you directly." "When?" "Today. This afternoon, if possible." Nia looked at the kitchen doorway, the staircase beyond it, the light from Minjay's office visible at the top. "I can be out by noon." "Good. There's something else." Han's voice dropped in a way that made Nia's hand tighten on the phone. "The Seojin Holdings connection to Hierin, Lee's team found something when they went deeper. The transfers to her accounts. They didn't start 3 years ago." "When did they start?" 6 years ago, Han said. "The month before she was hired by Minjay's organization." The kitchen went very quiet. "She didn't infiltrate his organization," Nia said slowly. "She was placed there." "She was placed there," Han confirmed. "Park Young-chul's people put her in from the beginning. 6 years of access. Every account, every contact, every operation Minjay has run in 6 years. She's had her hands on all of it." Nia sat down on one of the kitchen stools because her legs asked her to. She thought about 6 years. She thought about a woman who had been in that organization before Nia had ever appeared. Before the marriage, before the foundation, before the first miscarriage. A woman who had been running a parallel operation the entire time. feeding intelligence to a rival syndicate while performing the role of loyal executive secretary with such consistency that a man who trusted no one had trusted her completely. He's going to find out, Nia said. At some point, Park Yong-chul is going to make his move, and Min Jae is going to realize what's been happening. And when he does, he'll look for who else knew, Han finished. Yes. And Hyerin will give him something to look at that isn't herself. The silence on the line was answer enough. Nia pressed her hand flat against the counter. The stone was cold. She focused on that, the specific temperature of the surface under her palm, and forced herself to breathe evenly. What do I need to bring to Lee this afternoon? Every screenshot, every document, every date and name you remember from what you overheard. He'll record the conversation formally. You'll be giving a protected statement. Han hesitated. Nia, once you sit down with Lee, you're committed. This becomes a federal matter. Min Jae's attorneys will eventually learn there's an active investigation, and when that happens, the environment in that house becomes unpredictable. It's already unpredictable, Nia said. More unpredictable, Han said, measurably more. Nia was quiet for a moment. She looked at the doorway again, at the staircase, at the light at the top of it. I'm committed, she said. I've been committed since the hallway. The FIU building was in Mapo, a gray institutional structure that looked like it had been designed to discourage attention. Prosecutor Lee Jin-ho met them in a conference room on the third floor. A thin man in his late 40s with a face that had the settled quality of someone who had spent a long time being lied to professionally and had stopped being surprised by it. He shook Nia's hand once, firmly, and sat down across from her and placed a digital recorder on the table without ceremony. Mrs. Kang, he said, I'm going to ask you to start from the beginning. Don't edit. Don't try to give me only what you think matters. Just tell me what happened in the order it happened. She told him. An hour and 40 minutes of telling him, with Han beside her and a cup of tea that went cold, and Lee asking questions in the flat, precise way of someone who already knows a significant portion of the answers and is checking her account against them. He asked about specific dates, about the names on documents, about the voice she'd heard through the door, whether she was certain it was Hyerin, how close she'd been standing, whether the door had been fully closed or partially. Partially, Nia said. How wide? 6 inches? Maybe 8? He wrote something down. And the name Song. Min Jae used it in what context exactly? He said the arrangement with Song's people. Then he referenced a timeline, 2 weeks after I signed the documents, and then she stopped. Take your time, Lee said. He said it needed to look like an accident. He mentioned the Jeju property. He said I drive the coastal road at night. She put her hands flat on the table because they wanted to shake and she wasn't going to let them. He was accurate about that. I do drive it at night. I've done it for years. Lee looked at her for a moment, and in that look was something that wasn't quite sympathy. He wasn't that kind of prosecutor, but was something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe, of what it cost to sit in a room and say these things out loud. Song Dae-won, Lee said. Does that name mean anything to you? No. He runs a contract operation out of Busan. We've been trying to put documentation on him for 3 years. Lee set his pen down. He's been used by Min Jae's organization twice before that we know of. Both incidents were ruled accidents. He let that sit for a second. We believe Song has already received a deposit on your contract. The room was very quiet. How long ago? Nia asked. Based on a wire transfer we've been watching, 4 days ago. Lee held her gaze. He moved up the timeline, Mrs. Kang. Whatever he observed or suspected recently, something changed his calculation. She thought about the kitchen. Wednesday morning, the door opening, the 2-second recalibration in Min Jae's face. The dinner question, she said mostly to herself. I'm sorry? Nothing. She looked at Lee. What do you need from me? The recording you described, the conversation you overheard. If you can get it on record, even a partial, it corroborates everything and accelerates the arrest timeline significantly. Without it, we're moving on the financial evidence, which is strong, but slow. Lee folded his hands. I don't want to ask you to go back into that environment to obtain it. But you need it. He didn't look away. It would help considerably. Han put a hand on Nia's arm. We don't have to decide this now. Yes, we do, Nia said. She looked at Lee. He meets with Hierin Thursday mornings. I know the room. I know the routine. I had a plan to position a recording device, but I lost the window this morning. She paused. There's another way. If I can get into his office tonight while he's downstairs, I can place a phone in a spot he won't move before tomorrow morning. The risk, Han started. I know the risk. She turned to Han. I know it. But Lee just told me the contract is already funded. 2 weeks was always generous. If Song's people are already in motion... She stopped. She looked back at Lee. How much time do I realistically have? Lee was quiet for a moment that felt like it took a week. If Song follows his pattern, he said, he stages and surveys for 7 to 10 days before moving. The deposit cleared 4 days ago. He held her eyes. Give or take. 3 to 6 days. She exhaled slowly through her nose. Then Thursday isn't soon enough, she said. I need to get into his office tonight. She was back in the mansion by 4:30. She made herself move through the afternoon with the careful normalcy of a woman who had nothing pressing on her mind. She spoke to the housekeeper about the weekend menu. She answered 3 emails from her foundation. She sat in the living room for an hour with a book open in her lap that she did not read. And when Min-jae came downstairs at 6, she had dinner started in the kitchen and the table was set, and she had already decided on the specific pretext she would use to explain why she needed to be in his office between 11 p.m. and midnight. She was going to tell him she'd left her reading glasses in there that afternoon. She didn't wear reading glasses, but the pair belonged to her mother, left behind on her last visit, kept in a drawer in the bedroom. And if Min-jae found them, she could say she'd been carrying them meaning to ship them, and they'd slipped out of her bag. It was thin, but it only needed to hold for 30 seconds. Dinner was quieter than the night before. Min-jae ate and scrolled his phone and offered 2 or 3 observations about things that didn't matter, and Naya responded and ate and kept her hand steady. At one point, he looked up at her with an expression that she couldn't fully read and said, "You seem better today." "I slept," she said. He nodded and looked back at his phone. She watched him for a second, the downward angle of his face, the way the light from his screen moved across it. 4 years. She thought, I am sitting across a dinner table from a man who has paid someone to kill me, and I am watching him eat, and I feel nothing but very cold and very clear, and I think that might be the most frightening thing about all of this. Not the danger, but the clarity. She went upstairs at 9, set her alarm for 11, lay in the dark, and waited. The alarm was unnecessary. She didn't sleep. At 11:10, she heard Min-jae's office door, footsteps on the stairs. He came to bed. She heard him in the bathroom, the sound of water, the familiar sequence of a man's nighttime routine reduced to audio, and lay down without disturbing her side of the bed, which he'd stopped doing a long time ago. She waited 20 more minutes until his breathing shifted. She got up. She took the phone from the nightstand, her secondary phone, a device she'd bought with cash 2 days ago and kept in the inner pocket of a coat she hadn't worn since, and held it in her hand in the dark. She looked at Min-jae's silhouette for a moment, the shape of him under the blanket, the particular stillness of a sleeping person who has no idea they're being watched. She went into the hallway. The house was dark. She knew every floor of it well enough to move without lights. She'd learned the layout the way you learn the inside of your own mouth, through years of daily contact until the knowledge becomes physical, held in muscle and foot rather than memory. She crossed the landing, reached the office door. The handle was cold. She turned it, quietly, slowly. The door opened, and she slipped inside and pulled it almost closed behind her and stood in the dark of the office for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The curtains weren't fully drawn. The Han River was visible through the gap. The city lights reflected on the black water, distant and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you're not able to fully look at them. She crossed to the credenza. The decorative bowl was there. Ceramic, black, wide enough to hold keys and a phone without anything looking deliberate. She set the secondary phone inside, face down, pressed the side button 3 times in the sequence that activated the continuous recording app she'd installed. No screen light, no sound, nothing visible, and then stood straight and looked at the desk. The file folder Hyerin had brought that morning was gone, but the desk had 3 stacks of documents on it, and something about their arrangement, the way they were placed, the spacing between them, told her they had been looked at recently. Not filed. Reconsidered. She should leave. She had what she came for. Every second she stood in this office was a second she was in the room where she should not be. She reached out and touched the top edge of the nearest document stack anyway. Just the top page. She tilted it barely, enough to see the letterhead. Park and Associates. She tilted it further. It was the estate documents, the ones she'd told Min-jae she wanted to review with her own attorney. She could see the signature lines at the bottom of the first page. And something else. Something she hadn't expected. Something that made her breath go tight and shallow before she fully understood what she was reading. There was a second signature line, below hers, and beside it, in the neat printed type of a legal document, Seo Hye-rin, witness. She stood in the dark office and stared at the paper, and her mind worked through what it meant. Not slowly, not with confusion, but with the awful clarity of someone whose picture of a situation just expanded to include something they hadn't been accounting for. Hye-rin wasn't just the facilitator. She wasn't just the conduit to Park Young-chul's syndicate. She was named in the documents. Her name was on the legal architecture, which meant that when the assets transferred, when Nia was gone and the accounts moved and the estate restructuring completed, Hye-rin's name was embedded in the chain of custody, not as a criminal, as a witness. A legally registered, formally named witness whose presence on the document would, in the hands of the right attorney, look like exactly the opposite of what it was. She was protecting herself. While selling Min-jae's operation piece by piece to a rival, she was also ensuring that when the whole thing came apart, when Park Young-chul made his move and Min-jae's empire crumbled, Hye-rin would appear in the legal record not as a conspirator, but as a functionary. A secretary who'd witnessed documents, someone unremarkable, someone who might get lost in the chaos. Nia set the paper down carefully, exactly as she'd found it. She was 3 steps from the door when she heard it. The sound was small, a shift of weight, the particular creak of the hallway floorboard just outside the office, the one 3 feet from the door, the one she'd learned to step over years ago because it announced arrivals. Someone was outside the door. She stopped breathing. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 8. She looked at the gap where the door was not fully closed, and in the darkness of the hallway beyond it she could see, or thought she could see, the faint outline of something. A shape. Still. Waiting. Then the shape moved. Footsteps, going the other direction. Back down the hallway, slow and unhurried. The sound faded. She stood in the dark office for 30 seconds without moving. Her heart was very loud. She was aware of the secondary phone in the bowl on the credenza, recording, invisible, doing exactly what she'd put it there to do. And she was aware that she was standing in a room that contained evidence that her husband had been awake and in the hallway outside this door, and she did not know for how long or how much he had heard. She counted to 40. She crossed to the door. She opened it. She looked both ways down the hallway, and it was empty and dark, and the floorboard 3 feet from the door was silent and still. She walked back to the bedroom, slowly, without touching the walls. Min-jae was in the bed, facing away from the door, his breathing even. She got into bed on her side. She lay on her back with her eyes open in the dark. She did not sleep again. In the morning, at 7:15, she came downstairs and found Min-jae already at the kitchen table with his coffee, dressed for the office, and he looked up at her when she came in and said, "Hye-rin called. She needs to come by this morning instead of tomorrow." He held her gaze for exactly 1 second. "I hope that's all right." Nia went to the coffee maker and kept her back to him and said, "Of course." Her hands did not shake, but she understood as she stood there with her back to him and her hands on the counter and the coffee machine making its noise, that the timeline she'd been calculating had just been taken out of her hands entirely, that Min-jae had been in that hallway for a reason she didn't yet know, and that whatever was in the phone on the credenza was now the only thing standing between her and a version of events she could not survive, and that she had no way of getting it out of that office before Hye-rin walked through the front door. She had 40 minutes. That was the window between Min-jae leaving the kitchen and Hye-rin arriving at the front gate. 40 minutes built from nothing but the routine she'd memorized over 4 years of living in this house, knowing that Min-jae showered before any meeting that mattered, that he spent 12 minutes in the bathroom and 8 minutes dressing, and that he would not go back to his office until Hye-rin was already inside, because he liked to be in position before the other person entered the room. 40 minutes. She poured her coffee. She drank half of it standing at the counter with her back to him. She heard him push back his chair, heard the particular sound of him folding the newspaper. He still read a physical newspaper, a habit she'd always found oddly human for a man who was otherwise entirely controlled. And then she heard him cross the kitchen and pause behind her. He didn't touch her. He almost never touched her anymore, and the absence of it had stopped feeling like loss and started feeling like information. "Don't overschedule yourself today," he said. "You've looked tired." "I'm fine," she said. She heard him leave the kitchen. She waited until she heard his footsteps on the stairs. She counted to 15. Then she set the mug down, walked to the entry hall, and stood at the bottom of the staircase listening to the water start in the master bathroom above her. 12 minutes. She went up the east staircase, not the main, landed 20 feet closer to his office door, and had a different acoustic signature. The carpet was thicker, the walls heavier. She moved quickly, but not fast enough to make sound. The way she'd moved as a girl through her mother's house late at night. The muscle memory of not wanting to wake anyone coming back to her now, with a different urgency entirely. The office door was closed, but not locked. He only locked it when he was inside. She turned the handle and went in. The credenza bowl was where she'd left it. The secondary phone was face down inside it, exactly as she'd placed it. She crossed the room in 6 steps, picked up the phone, pressed the side button sequence to stop the recording, and looked at the screen. 11 hours and 43 minutes of audio. She had no way of knowing if anything useful was on it. She had no way of knowing if Min-jae had come back into this office after she'd heard him in the hallway, had stood in this room in the dark, had noticed something different about the bowl on the credenza, and chosen to say nothing because saying nothing was sometimes more strategic than confrontation. She didn't know. She couldn't know. What she knew was that she had 11 hours and 43 minutes of audio from an office where a man had discussed having her killed, and that she had a phone in her hand, and that the water was still running upstairs. She put the secondary phone in the pocket of her cardigan. She left the office. She went back down the east staircase. She was in the kitchen refilling her coffee when she heard the water stop. 8 minutes of dressing. She typed a message to Han with her personal phone while the coffee maker ran, "I have audio. Don't know what's on it. Need to get it out of the house before 9:30. She sent it and put the phone in her other pocket and stood at the counter and looked out the kitchen window at the garden. Brown and bare in November, the last of the ornamental grass, flattened by the previous week's rain, and thought about what she was about to do. She could not review the recording here. She could not send 11 hours of audio over any network she didn't completely trust. She needed to physically move the phone out of this house and into Han's hands, and she needed to do it before Hyerin walked through the front door, because Hyerin had 6 years of practiced observation, and Nia was not certain her face could hold another 45 minutes of performance without something showing. Han replied in 3 minutes. "Send Dae-sik now. Tell him to come alone, park 2 streets over. Don't bring the device in your bag. Wear a pocket." She was already wearing a pocket. She looked down at the cardigan. The secondary phone sat against her hip like a stone. She texted Dae-sik. He replied in 40 seconds. He'd been her driver long enough to understand that some instructions didn't require explanation, and he'd been in Min-jae's employment long enough to understand that loyalty in this household was more complicated than it looked. She'd never asked him directly whose side he was on. She hadn't needed to. There were moments, small, deniable, unremarkable, when he had placed himself slightly between her and a situation that felt wrong, and she had noted every single one of them over 6 years and said nothing, because some alliances are more durable for being unspoken. She set her coffee down. She walked to the entry hall, pulled her coat from the hook, and put it on over the cardigan without making noise. She opened the front door. The November air was cold and smelled like wet stone and exhaust from the main road 2 blocks over. She walked down the front steps, along the side of the property, through the service gate that opened with a keypad she'd memorized without being asked. Around the corner, 2 streets over. Dae-sik was there. The car was running. He didn't look at her when she got in the back, not out of indifference, but because he was watching the mirrors the way he always watched the mirrors when something was happening that required watching. She put the secondary phone on the seat between them. "To Attorney Han's office," she said. "Deliver this directly to her, not to the receptionist, to her." He picked it up. "And you?" "I'm going back." She got out of the car. He looked at her then, a look she felt on the back of her neck as she turned away, brief and weighted with something she didn't have time to receive, and she walked back along the side street and through the service gate and up the front steps and into the house. She hung her coat up. She was in the kitchen when Min-jae came downstairs, dressed, composed, carrying the weight of his intentions with the same posture he brought to everything, upright, unhurried, a man who believed the situation was under his control. "Yerin will be here at 9:30, he said. "I know," Nia said. "You mentioned." He poured coffee. She watched him from behind her mug and felt the distance between who she was 40 minutes ago and who she was required to be right now, and she crossed it the way you cross cold water, fast, without thinking about it too long. Well, Yerin arrived at 9:27. Nia heard the gate, heard the front door, heard Yerin's heels on the entry hall floor, a sound so specific it had its own texture, precise and measured, the walk of a woman who had decided exactly how she moved in every room she entered. She heard Min-jae come out of the kitchen to greet her, heard the brief professional exchange, heard them move toward the staircase. She did not go to the hallway. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone and an untouched piece of toast, and she waited. Han called at 9:51. Her voice was different from any previous call, not tighter, not louder, but compressed in a way that meant she was controlling something. "I've reviewed 40 minutes of the audio," Han said, without preamble. "Nia, it's there." Nia's hand went still on the table. "Min-jae came back to the office at 11:43 last night," Han said, "after you'd already gone back to the bedroom. He made a call. Not on his main line. It sounds like a second device. The audio quality shifts. He called Song Daewon directly." "What did he say?" "He said," Han paused, "not for effect, for accuracy. He said the timeline needed to compress, that there'd been a change in the domestic situation. His words. He told Song to move the operation to the end of the week." A beat. "Nia, today is Thursday." The kitchen was very quiet. "End of the week means tomorrow or Saturday," Nia said. "Yes." She looked at the table, the toast, the untouched coffee, the ordinary debris of a morning in a house where she had approximately 48 hours to live if she didn't move now. "Get Lee on the phone," she said. Tell him we have the call. Tell him it's direct contact between Min-jae and Song, time-stamped last night, with explicit discussion of an accelerated operation. Tell him I need an arrest today. He may not have enough to... He has 14 months of financial evidence and a recorded phone call between a crime boss and a contract operative discussing the murder of a federal witness. Her voice didn't shake. She was surprised by that. "That's enough. Tell him today." She hung up. She sat for another 30 seconds. Upstairs, she could hear nothing. The insulation in this house was one of its selling points. Thick walls, acoustic privacy. The silence of the very wealthy who preferred not to hear or be heard. She thought about the secondary phone being in Han's office right now, being fed into a computer, being processed by the FIU with Lee's authorization and the weight of 14 months of groundwork behind it. She thought about Saturday. She thought about a coastal road and a car, and a version of events that Min-jae had planned with the same attention to detail he brought to every other problem he'd ever solved. She stood up. She was not going to wait in this kitchen for Lee to decide the timing. She was not going to perform another meal, another evening, another morning of managed normalcy, while Song Daewon's people surveyed and positioned and prepared. She had spent 3 years being careful with this marriage, 3 years grieving beside a man who was building the architecture of her destruction, and she was done being the person in this story who waits. She went upstairs. She didn't stop at the office door. She opened it. Min-jae and Hyerin were at the desk. The file folder opened between them, the estate documents spread out, a pen lying at an angle that told her someone had just put it down. And both of them looked up when she came in, and neither of them said anything for a full 3 seconds, because she had come in differently than she'd ever come in before. Not tentative, not apologetic, not managing her own presence downward to a manageable size. She came in and stood in the middle of the room and looked at both of them. "Nia," Min-jae said. His voice was even. "Careful. We're in the middle of..." "I know what you're in the middle of," she said. Something shifted in his face. Small, controlled, but there. Hyerin didn't move. She sat with her hands folded on the desk and her expression set to the professional mask she'd worn for 6 years, and Nia looked at her directly, which she'd never done before. Not really, not with this kind of attention, and saw something behind the mask that Hyerin hadn't bothered to hide because she'd never expected to need to. Calculation. Pure and impersonal, the expression of someone running numbers. "I need both of you to stay in this room," Nia said. Min-jae stood up, slowly, the way he did everything. "Nia, sit down." He didn't. He came around the desk in 2 steps, and his face was still composed, but his eyes had changed. That flat, interior dark she'd glimpsed twice before in their marriage, always in moments when he was handling something that required force, and he stopped 3 feet from her. "You're not yourself," he said. Low. A register she recognized, the voice he used to manage situations. "Let's go downstairs and you called Song Dae-won last night." She said it clearly, plainly. No accusation in her voice, just the fact, placed on the table between them like the pen on the document. "At 11:43, you told him to move the operation to the end of the week." The room went entirely still. Min-jae's face did something she'd never seen it do. Not fear. She didn't think he was capable of fear in the ordinary sense. Something more structural. A reorientation. The expression of a man whose plan has just developed a problem he didn't anticipate and is already, in real time, calculating around it. Yerin stood up. "Sit down," Nia said to her too, and something in her voice, some frequency she hadn't known she had, made Yerin actually pause. Min-jae took another step toward her, and she took one back and said, "There are federal investigators listening to that recording right now. If something happens to me in the next 60 seconds, every one of them hears it." She watched his face. "Do the math." He stopped. The 3 of them stood in that office with the Han River outside the window and the estate documents on the desk, and 4 years of marriage condensed into this, 2 people staring at each other across a truth that had been buried under performance and grief and carefully managed silence, and the woman standing between them who had served both of them and neither of them, and who was now watching with the particular attention of someone recalculating her own exit. "How long have you known?" Min-jae said. Not a question. An assessment. "Long enough," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She saw him working through it, what she knew, what she'd done with it, how far the exposure went, whether there was still a version of this he could manage. She could see the machinery of it turning behind his eyes. And for the first time she was not afraid of it, because she'd already done the thing he hadn't expected her to be capable of. "The document," he said. His voice shifted, harder now, the smoothness gone. "What did you do with Min-jae?" She held his gaze. "It's over." Yerin moved, not toward the door, toward the desk, toward the file folder, which Nia registered in the same second that she registered the small, calculated deliberateness of it. Yerin reaching for the documents, not to run, but to take. To take the papers before anything was secured because Yerin's name was on them, because Yerin had her own interests in this room that were not Min-jae's interests and were not Nia's interests and were aligned exclusively with the question of her own survival. Min-jae saw it too. And the look he turned on Yerin in that moment, Nia would not forget it. She had seen Min-jae look at problems. She had seen him look at competitors, at weak men, at situations that needed resolving. This was different. This was the look of a man who had just understood, in real time, that the person he'd trusted most had been the most deliberate threat, and the expression on his face was not rage, not yet. It was something worse, the clean, cold zero of a man who has just reclassified someone from asset to target. "Yerin," he said. She stopped. She stood with her hand on the folder, and her face still controlled, and she looked at him, and in that look was something that was almost honest. The first honest thing Nia had seen in that office. Not fear, acknowledgement. The look of a woman who knew the game was done and had decided to stop pretending otherwise. "Park Yong-chul," Min-jae said. One name, almost no inflection. Yerin said nothing. The silence lasted 4 seconds, and then Min-jae crossed the room toward her and Nia stepped between them. Not because she cared about protecting Yerin, but because she needed both of them in this room and breathing when Lee's team arrived. And she put herself directly in Min-jae's path and said, "Don't." He stopped because she was there, because she was physically in the way, because some reflex in him, something too old and too automatic to override, still registered her presence as something to root around rather than through. She felt his breath on her face, 3 inches away, the specific warmth of it. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "what you've done." "I have every idea," she said. Her phone rang. She didn't look at it. She held his eyes and let it ring twice, and then reached into her pocket without breaking eye contact and answered it. Han's voice, rapid, compressed. Lee's team is 8 minutes out. They're coming with a warrant. Nia, is he there? Yes, she said. Both of them? Yes. Stay in the room. Don't let either of them leave. I know, she said. She hung up. Min-jae had heard enough. She watched it register. 8 minutes, warrant, both names. And she watched him make the decision she'd been afraid he'd make. The one she'd hoped the exposure would prevent. The one he was making anyway because Min-jae was not a man who waited for things to arrive. He moved toward the door. She stepped with him. He tried to go around her and she moved again, and he stopped and looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite fury and wasn't quite respect and was something she didn't have a clean name for. Nia. Low. Warning. 8 minutes, she said. You can spend them trying to get past me, or you can spend them being the man I spent 4 years thinking you were. Something went through his face that she didn't expect. Not softening, not that, but something older. Something that might have been, in a different life, the beginning of regret. Hye-rin was already moving. She'd waited for the moment when both of them were focused on each other. The oldest strategy there is, the one Hye-rin had been executing for 6 years without anyone noticing. And she had the folder under her arm and was 4 steps from the door when Nia turned and said, "The document has your name on it, Hye-rin. Whatever you take out of this room, your name is still on the version Lee's team already has." Hye-rin stopped. She stood in the doorway with the folder and her composure and 6 years of performance, and for the first time the mask was not entirely in place. Underneath it was something that looked almost like exhaustion. The particular kind that comes from running a very long con and reaching the moment when the running stops. She looked at Nia, not at Min-jae, at Nia. "You're smarter than he gave you credit for," Hye-rin said. "I know," Nia said. Hye-rin put the folder back on the desk. The 3 of them stood in the office. The man who had planned a murder, the woman he'd planned it with, and the woman they'd planned it against, and waited. In the particular silence of people who have run out of moves, while the city went about its Thursday morning outside the window, and the Han River moved south in the gray November light, indifferent and slow and permanent, in a way that none of what was happening in that room would ever be. Min-jae sat down. Nia wasn't sure she'd ever seen him simply sit before, not the controlled lowering into a chair that he usually performed, not the deliberate positioning of a man who understands that how you occupy space communicates something. He sat the way tired people sit, the way people sit when the thing that holds their posture together is no longer operating. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor, and for a moment he looked like something close to human. She almost felt something. Then she thought about a phone call at 11:43 and a coastal road in Jeju and the word accident said in the same tone as a state restructuring, and the feeling passed. Her phone buzzed. A text from Han. 2 minutes. Main entrance. Open the gate. She crossed to the window. Below, on the street, she could see 2 dark vehicles moving slowly toward the property. Unmarked but obvious, the way law enforcement vehicles are always obvious to people who have learned to read the street. The particular careful pace, the way they were positioned relative to each other. She looked at Min-jae. He was still looking at the floor. Not at her, not at Hye-rin, not at the estate documents that represented years of deliberate construction now rendered useless. He was looking at the floor with the expression of someone doing something privately that they would never allow an audience for, and she recognized it. She recognized it because she'd done it herself, in a hospital room 3 times, receiving news that broke the version of the future she'd been holding. And she turned away from him because watching it felt like a trespass on something she no longer had any part of. She went to the desk. She picked up her personal phone, opened the security app, and opened the front gate. Downstairs, in the entry hall, she heard the gate, and then the front door, and then footsteps. More than 2 people. The deliberate, organized sound of people moving through a space with a purpose. And she stood in the office and waited for them to come up. Hye-rin was very still. She had not tried again to leave. She stood beside the window with her arms at her sides and her face composed. A different composure than the mask she'd worn before. Not performance, just the blankness of someone who has accepted where the next hour is going. Lee Jin-ho came through the office door first, 2 officers behind him. He looked at the room, at Min-jae on the chair, at Hye-rin at the window, at Nia standing between them, and he took it in with the practiced efficiency of someone who does not need to narrate what he's seen. He looked at Nia. "Are you injured?" "No," she said. He nodded once. He turned to Min-jae. He said the words, the specific, formal, legally required words of an arrest. And Min-jae looked up when he heard his name, and for one moment looked at Nia across the office with an expression she wouldn't be able to fully describe even later, when she had more distance from it. Not rage. Not betrayal. Something quieter. Something that might have been, if things had been entirely different from the start, an apology. She didn't look away. One of the officers reached Min-jae, and he stood without being prompted, the last vestige of control, that he stood on his own, and submitted to the process with a stillness that might have looked like dignity to someone who didn't know him well enough to read it as something else. Hyerin was read her rights at the window. She listened with her eyes on the middle distance and said nothing, which was exactly what Nia would have expected. Lee crossed to Nia when it was done. He was quiet for a moment. "The recording," he said, "has everything," she confirmed, "including the call to Song Dae-won." He exhaled, very quietly, barely audible. "We'll move on Song within the hour, his team and whatever surveillance he has in place." He paused. "You should not be in this house tonight." "I know." She'd known since 11:43 the previous night. "I have somewhere to go." He nodded. He started to turn away. "Lee." He stopped. She looked at him. "Park Yong-chul, Hyerin's handler. How long before—" "We've had a parallel operation running on Seogean Holdings for 8 months," he said. "Today's evidence accelerates the warrant. By tomorrow morning." He held her gaze. "It's done, Mrs. Kong. All of it." She looked around the office, the credenza with the empty bowl, the desk with the estate documents, the chair where Min-jae had sat and looked at the floor, the window where Hye-rin had stood and calculated exits, the 4 walls of a room where she had stood at midnight retrieving a phone, where she had stood this morning and watched the whole thing come apart. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. She walked out of the office, down the hallway, down the main staircase, through the entry hall, past the officers positioned at the front entrance who stepped back to let her through. She went out the front door. The November air hit her like something she'd been holding her breath for. Cold and carrying the smell of the river, and entirely indifferent to everything that had just happened inside that house. She stood on the front steps and breathed it in. 1 breath, 2. And then she reached into her coat pocket and pressed her hand flat against the folded ultrasound image that had been there since the morning she'd walked into Dr. Lim's office and heard the words she'd stopped letting herself want. 8 weeks. Strong heartbeat. She stood on the steps of a house that was no longer hers in any meaningful sense and felt the cold move through her coat and looked out at the street where Lee's vehicles were parked and officers were moving with purpose. And the city was going about its morning with complete disregard for the fact that the entire shape of her life had just changed. She had her phone out, Han's number ready. She had a baby in her pocket, or something close enough to it, a folded piece of paper that was the first proof of a person who did not yet know that they had come within 48 hours of never getting to arrive. And she had a future that was raw and unmade and terrifying in the way that open space is terrifying when you have been enclosed for a very long time. She pressed call. Han picked up on the first ring. "It's done," Nia said, her voice held. "Come get me." The line was quiet for 2 seconds. Then Han said, "I'm already on my way." And Nia heard the sound of a car in motion behind the words, and she understood that Han had been driving since before the call ended, had been in motion before Nia even knew she was safe. And something about that, the simple fact of someone already moving toward her before she asked, made her press her lips together hard against everything she'd been holding back for 4 days. She didn't cry. Not yet. She stood on the steps and watched a black car appear at the end of the street and move toward her through the gray November morning, and she waited, and she breathed, and she kept her hand pressed flat against her coat pocket, and the thing inside it that had a strong heartbeat and no idea what it had just survived. Han's car was still warm when Nia got back inside it. The engine was running. Han had not turned it off, which meant Han had known she was coming back quickly, which meant Han had understood something about the state of the situation before Nia had said a word. That was the thing about Han So-young that Nia had stopped noticing because it had become reliable. The woman processed information at a velocity that most people never reached in a crisis, and she processed it without advertising that she was doing it, which made the results look like intuition when they were actually just sustained and disciplined attention. Song Dae-won, Han said. She said it before Nia had pulled the door fully shut, which meant she'd been holding it. Lee said within the hour, Nia told her. It's been 90 minutes since Lee said that. Han was already moving the car, pulling away from the curb with the measured deliberateness of someone who does not want to appear to be leaving quickly. My contact at FIU has been texting me since before you came out of the house. Song's surveillance team, the two individuals he had positioned on your routine, they've been picked up. But Song himself was not at the address they had on file. The warmth of the car felt different now. Nia sat with it and let the information land. How long has he been gone from that address? Unknown. Han glanced in the rearview mirror. Could be since last night. Could be since this morning. She paused at a light. Her hands were completely still on the wheel. There are two plainclothes officers behind us. Gray sedan. Nia checked the mirror. The sedan was there, 2 car lengths back, moving with them. She hadn't noticed it before she knew to look for it. She noticed it now and felt something complicated about the noticing, about needing it, about the fact that the most banal feature of the day, a car following at a polite distance on a city street, was the thing keeping her alive while Song Dae-won's location remained unknown. Where are we going? She said. My apartment, not my office. Han took a left without signaling because she was watching the cars behind her and had made a calculation. My office address is published. My apartment is registered to a property management company and has been for 11 years. She merged onto a wider road. I had someone collect what you need from your foundation office yesterday morning. Documents, your personal identification, your medical files. They're already there. Nia looked at her. Yesterday morning. Before you went to FIU, Han confirmed. She said it without inflection, the way you say things that don't require justification. Nia looked forward. Through the windshield. Seoul moved past in its ordinary Thursday morning configuration. Buses, storefronts, people moving on sidewalks with the focused disregard of urban life. None of them aware that somewhere in this city, a man named Song Dae-won was unaccounted for, and the plainclothes officers in the gray sedan behind them were checking their mirrors with more frequency than the traffic justified. She pressed her hand against her coat pocket. The ultrasound image was there, still folded, still warm from her body. Han, she said. Yes. She'd been deciding whether to say it since Monday morning in Dr. Lim's office. She'd been carrying it alone for 4 days because she hadn't been able to afford the distraction of anyone else's reaction, and because saying it out loud made it real in a way that felt dangerous when everything else was also dangerous, and one more real thing might be too many. I'm pregnant, she said. The car was quiet. Han did not react with her face or her hands or her posture. The city continued past the windshield. The gray sedan held its distance. How far? Han said. 8 weeks, as of Monday. Does anyone know outside of your medical provider? No. Han took a breath in through her nose. She let it out slowly. She checked the rearview mirror and then looked back at the road and was quiet for a moment that had a specific weight to it. Not the weight of hesitation, but of someone letting something be as large as it actually is before they respond to it. Then it stays contained, Han said, until Song is in custody and the immediate threat picture is confirmed clear. She glanced at Nia, not a quick glance, a real one, brief but complete. Monday morning. You went from hearing a strong heartbeat to everything that followed. Yes. Han looked back at the road. Something in the line of her jaw shifted, almost imperceptible, the movement of a woman allowing herself to feel something she would not be naming out loud. Okay, she said, just that word. Flat and complete and carrying more in it than most sentences 3 times its length. Nia turned back to the window. She watched the city pass and breathed and let okay be enough, because it was exactly enough, which was the only reason it worked. Han's apartment occupied the 9th floor of a building in Mapo that had been designed to look precisely as unremarkable as every adjacent structure on the block. The elevator required a physical key. The hallway on the 9th floor was carpeted in a dull gray that absorbed sound, and Han's door had 2 locks and a third that wasn't visible until you knew where to look. Nia stood in the apartment and looked at it, the ordered bookshelves, the clean kitchen, the single window facing the street at an angle that allowed observation without exposure, and understood that she was looking at the living space of someone who had spent 20 years being careful, and that careful people build the physical environments around them to reflect what they've learned about the world. She sat on the couch with her coat still on. Her phone buzzed on the cushion beside her. Lee. She picked it up on the second ring. Songdae-won was located at 1047, Lee said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear something underneath it. The specific compressed quality of someone who has been holding a great deal of tension and has just felt the largest part of it release. Incheon, a property registered to a logistics front. We found him along with 3 additional associates and documentation connecting his current operation directly to the contract on you. He paused. All 4 individuals are in custody. The surveillance infrastructure he had in place on your movements has been fully dismantled. She closed her eyes. 3 seconds. She counted them without trying to. The immediate threat to your safety is neutralized, Lee continued. We're maintaining the surveillance detail on you through tonight as procedural caution, but operationally, it's done. She opened her eyes. The apartment was still around her. Through the window, the street below was doing what streets do. Indifferent and continuous and entirely unbothered by the news she'd just received. The investigation, she said. The charges against Min Jae. Filed tomorrow. We have the financial evidence, the recordings, the time-stamped call to Songdae-won, and preliminary cooperation from 2 members of his organization who have already made contact through their attorneys. A pause. Mrs. Kong, the case is comprehensive. I've been building towards something like this for 14 months. What you brought us in the past 4 days made it unassailable. She thought about 14 months. About Lee sitting in that building in Mapo, with his flat, careful face and his stack of financial documents and his 14 months of work, and about the 4 days she'd spent moving through her own house like a woman diffusing something, and about how those 2 timelines had found each other and what it had taken for them to do so. Park Yong-chul, she said, arrested at 8:15 this morning. The Seojin Holdings warrant was executed simultaneously with the events at the mansion. We'd been coordinating that warrant for 8 months. Today's evidence from the recordings and Hye-rin's immediate responses on arrest gave us what we needed to close the loop. He paused. The parallel operation held. And Hye-rin. She's talking. Lee said it without editorializing, which was its own kind of editorial. She has counsel present, and she's cooperative. She understands her position. Another pause, this one different, more deliberate. She confirmed on record that you had no knowledge of or participation in your husband's operations. The targeting of you was entirely predicated on your status as an asset to be removed. It will matter for the Foundation recovery proceedings. Nia sat with that for a moment. The specific strange sensation of being formally confirmed innocent of a crime you'd never committed. The bureaucratic acknowledgement of something that should never have required acknowledgement. Can the Foundation accounts be recovered? She asked. Attorney Han's office is the correct venue for that question, Lee said carefully. But the transfers were executed under documented coercive fraud. Every legal mechanism for contestation applies. I can tell you that the Dyson Capital accounts are frozen as of this morning, and that the legal basis for asset recovery is as strong as anything I've seen in a financial crime case at this level. She thought about the 27 documents she'd signed without reading over the course of 18 months. She thought about the signature she hadn't given, the one Min Jae had been waiting for when she'd walked through the office door that morning with the recording already in her hand. Thank you, she told Lee. She meant it plainly, without performance. Thank you, he said back. And she heard in those 2 words the weight of 14 months, and she let herself receive them. That night, Han made rice and a soup that was salted past the point of subtlety, and they ate it at the small kitchen table without discussing anything that required effort. And Nia understood that this was deliberate, that Han So-young, who could have spent the meal strategizing the next 6 weeks of legal proceedings and probably wanted to, was choosing instead to offer an hour of ordinary things, and that this choice was itself a form of care that Nia received without naming it. She slept 11 hours. She woke in Han's spare bedroom in the early afternoon and lay still for several minutes looking at the unfamiliar ceiling, water stain in the shape of nothing particular in the upper left corner, the particular quality of light through curtains she hadn't chosen, and ran an inventory of herself the way you check the contents of something after it's been through a rough passage. She was there, intact. The pregnancy was there. She put a hand to her stomach in the bed, aware that at 8 weeks there was nothing yet to feel, that the gesture was its own kind of communication rather than information gathering, and she lay with her hand there and breathed and let the fact of it be simply what it was without building anything around it yet. She got up, she showered. She sat at Han's kitchen table with coffee while Han moved through her morning routine with the efficiency of someone who had been living alone for long enough that the apartment's rhythms were perfectly calibrated to exactly one person. The foundation accounts, Nia said. Han sat down across from her with her own coffee. The Dason capital freeze is already in place. The charitable trust holdings are going to require a formal petition for recovery. It'll move through the civil courts alongside the criminal proceedings, which means the timeline is measured in months, not weeks. How many months? 4 to 6 for the primary accounts. The remainder, the portion tied to Minji's remaining corporate entities, longer, a year, possibly 2. Han said it the way she always delivered difficult information, cleanly, without softening it into something misleading. The criminal conviction will strengthen every civil claim substantially. The stronger the criminal case, the shorter the civil timeline. Then I want the criminal case to be airtight, Nia said. It already is. Han picked up her coffee. But I'll behave as if it's not, because that's how airtight cases stay airtight. Nia looked at her across the table. She thought about the sequence of decisions that had led to this moment, the one she'd made in a hospital corridor 4 days ago when she'd scrolled to Han's name in her contacts and pressed send, the one Han had made in responding, the one they'd both made in every hour since. She thought about the particular luck of having made the right call, which was different from the skill of it, even if skill was also involved. I didn't know if you'd take the meeting, Nia said. Han looked at her. Of course I took the meeting. We'd had coffee twice. I know what I observed in those 2 coffees, Han said simply. I don't need a long history to recognize someone who is bringing me something real. She set her cup down. You were also clearly in the kind of situation where waiting to be sure was the same as being too late. Nia nodded slowly. You had good instincts about who to call, Han said. That matters. A lot of people in your situation don't call anyone, or call the wrong person, and the story ends differently. She paused. Give yourself credit for the instinct. The weeks that followed moved in 2 registers simultaneously. In the legal register, they moved with the slow, grinding certainty of a large machine working as intended, charges filed, arraignment scheduled, evidence logged and cataloged and entered into the formal record of the state's case against Kang Min-jae on 9 separate counts. Min-jae's attorneys were expensive and skilled and filed 3 motions in the first 2 weeks that Han characterized as standard delaying tactics executed without genuine conviction, because the evidence wasn't the kind you could motion around. Lee's 14 months of groundwork and 4 days of Nia's recordings had produced a case file that one of Lee's colleagues, according to Han's contact, had described privately as the most complete prosecution package the FIU had assembled in a decade. Nia was asked to give formal testimony twice. She gave it both times with precision and without visible distress, not because she didn't feel it, but because she had decided that the feelings were hers and the testimony was the state's, and mixing them was not going to serve either purpose. She sat in the interview rooms and answered questions about the hallway, the door, the specific words spoken, the tone and register of voices, the layout of the office, the position of the credenza, the sequence of events from the afternoon at the hospital through the morning of the arrests, and she answered each question as if the answer was the only thing in the room. She was asked once, by one of Min-jae's attorneys, in a deposition setting, whether she had ever discussed the estate documents with her husband before the morning she confronted him. He placed them in front of me and told me they were estate planning, she said. He did not discuss them with me. He presented them for signature. And you didn't think to seek independent legal counsel at that time. She looked at the attorney. She took her time about it. I was in the process of recovering from my 3rd miscarriage, she said. My husband told me the documents were for our protection. I trusted him. She paused. I won't be answering any follow-up questions about whether I should have trusted him differently. Han, seated beside her, did not smile. But the corner of one eye moved in a way that communicated everything. In the personal register, the weeks moved differently, slower in some ways, faster in others, with the uneven texture of time that doesn't have an external structure imposing order on it. Nia rented the apartment in Mapo 3 weeks after the arrest. 3 rooms, a view of the building across the narrow street, a kitchen with a window that caught the morning light at an angle that turned the counter gold for about 20 minutes each day, which she noticed and appreciated in the way of someone paying attention to small things on purpose. She furnished it gradually, which was also on purpose. She'd come from a mansion that had been fully realized when she arrived in it. Min-jae's aesthetic imposed on every surface, his choices made before she had any relationship to the space. She wanted to know, this time, what she actually preferred. It turned out she preferred less than she'd thought. Fewer surfaces, more light. A bookshelf that took 3 weeks to fill because she only put things on it that she'd chosen herself. Her foundation office was reinstated at 8 weeks post-arrest, once the immediate legal freeze on associated accounts was lifted and the civil recovery petition was filed. Walking back in through the door. The first morning felt like something she didn't have a word for. Not triumph, not relief exactly. More like the specific sensation of returning to something you thought you might have lost and discovering it was exactly where you left it. Her assistant, a young woman named Park Ji-ah, who had been with the foundation for 2 years and who had, during the investigation, quietly organized every document and record in the office into formats that would be legible to forensic accountants, met her at the door with coffee and a stack of flagged correspondence and said, without preamble, "We have 18 backlogged partnership requests, and the Scholarship Review Committee is 3 weeks behind." "Good morning to you too," Nia said. "We're behind," Jia said, handing her the coffee. "I know. Let's start with the scholarships." She worked. It turned out to be one of the things that helped most, not in the way that people talk about work as distraction, as something to hide behind or fill the space where other things used to be, but in the way that purposeful work actually helps, by requiring your full attention on something that matters and giving that attention somewhere real to land. The Foundation's scholarship program had 17 candidates in review. Nia read every file herself. She stayed late 2 evenings that first week and the week after, and Jia stayed with her without being asked because Jia was that kind of person, the kind who shows up and doesn't explain it. At 16 weeks, Nia called her mother. She sat on the floor of the Mapo apartment with her back against the couch because the couch was new and still slightly stiff, and the floor was more honest. And she called Lagos in the early evening Seoul time, which was mid-morning Lagos time. And her mother answered on the second ring the way she always answered, which was to say immediately, as if she'd been near the phone. "Mama," Nia said. "Baby," her mother said. She told her. Not everything. Not the recordings or the details of the conspiracy or the specific legal architecture of the fraud. The shape of it. What had happened, what she'd done about it, where she was now. And at the end of it, she said, "I'm 16 weeks pregnant. Everything is healthy. I have a good doctor." The silence on the phone lasted long enough that Nia said, "Mama, are you there?" "I'm here." Her mother's voice was thick with something that wasn't quite a single emotion, happiness and grief and relief, and the complicated thing that happens when you've been worried about someone for a long time and you've been holding it quietly, and then they call and some part of what you've been holding gets set down. "I'm right here." "I know," Nia said. Her mother arrived 9 days later. She came through the airport carrying a single large suitcase and 3 bags of food items that were technically prohibited in customs declarations, but which she had navigated through with the confidence of a woman who has spent 63 years moving through the world on her own terms. She looked at the Mapo apartment, the 3 rooms, the slowly filling bookshelf, the kitchen with its morning light, and she didn't say anything about what it wasn't, which was everything Nia needed her not to say. "The kitchen faces east," her mother observed. "For about 20 minutes, Nia said. "In the morning." Her mother nodded as if this were a significant piece of information that had been correctly reported. Then she put her bags down and opened them and began to fill the refrigerator with things she'd brought, and the apartment filled up immediately with the particular domestic density of her presence. And Nia stood in the kitchen doorway and watched it happen and felt something that had been held at a particular tension for a very long time begin, incrementally, to ease. Yiren's cooperation ran to 11 formal sessions over 6 weeks, according to Lee, who updated Nia, not because she'd requested it, but because he'd decided she deserved to know the shape of what her recordings had set in motion. The intelligence Yiren provided on Park Yong-chul's network was, by Lee's account, structurally comprehensive. The kind of information that can only come from someone who has spent 6 years in deliberate proximity to the target, who has observed not just the operations but the architecture beneath them, the relationships and the money flows, and the methods of insulation that sophisticated criminal organizations use to protect themselves from exactly this kind of exposure. Park Yong-chul was charged across 3 jurisdictions. 6 of the 23 counts related specifically to the infiltration of Min Jae's organization over those 6 years. The remaining counts covered a range of financial and organized crime violations that the FIU and 2 cooperating international agencies had been building toward for the better part of a decade. Nia never asked to see the details of Hye-rin's testimony. She had no need for them. What she needed was what Lee gave her, the knowledge that the machinery was running and would reach its conclusion, and that her role in that conclusion was complete. She was done being a person around whom other people's plots organized themselves. She was done being the asset, the target, the variable in someone else's calculation. She'd been those things. She'd lived inside that structure without knowing she was in it. And the knowing now was the end of it, not because knowing changed the past, but because it changed every future decision she would make, permanently and without the possibility of reverting. She did not think about Hye-rin in the way of someone processing a personal betrayal, because Hye-rin had never known her, had never looked at her and seen a person rather than a component, had never sat across from her and registered anything except the information value of her proximity. You cannot be personally betrayed by someone who was never personally present. What Hye-rin had done was cold and systematic and had nearly cost Nia everything, and also it had nothing to do with Nia as a human being, which was its own specific category of thing to sit with. She sat with it for a while. Then she set it down. Min Jae was different. She didn't sit with Min Jae the same way because sitting with Min Jae required confronting the 4 years, not just the crime, required looking at the entire edifice of the marriage and deciding what was real inside it and what was performance, and whether there was any meaningful version of both things being true. She didn't do this all at once. She did it in increments, mostly in the late evenings after her mother was asleep and the apartment was quiet, sitting at the kitchen table with something to drink and the particular honesty that comes when there's no one to perform for. The conclusion she reached, slowly and without drama, was this. She had loved a man who existed partly, the part of him that had been present and real, the intelligence, the occasional unguarded warmth, the way he listened when he chose to listen, the specific gravity of his attention. Those things had been real. She hadn't imagined them. They had happened. And that real person had also, simultaneously, been a man who had spent years building the infrastructure of her death. And both of those things were true of the same human being, and that was the most disturbing thing about it. Not the evil of it, but the ordinariness of the coexistence. The way a person can be genuinely one thing and also, in a different room, entirely another. She didn't forgive him. She looked at the question of forgiveness carefully, the way she looked at all questions carefully now. And she decided that forgiveness was a transaction that required the other party to be part of your future in some meaningful sense. And Min Jae was not part of her future. What she wanted instead was simpler and harder to name, something like the release of his claim on her understanding of herself. She had spent 4 years seeing herself refracted through his perceptions, and those perceptions had been managed and curated and ultimately weaponized, and she was done with all of it. Done with the version of herself that existed in relation to him. Done with the grief of the marriage and the loss of the person she'd believed him to be, and the specific loneliness of having loved carefully and still ended up alone in a hallway, overhearing the terms of her own death. She was done. Not healed, she had no illusions about the cleanliness of what healing looked like, but done in the way that matters, which is the way where you stop turning back toward the thing that hurt you, to check if it still looks as dangerous as you remember. It did. She just stopped checking. Kofi was born on a Tuesday in late April at 38 weeks and 2 days. He announced himself in the way that she would later understand was characteristic of him, ahead of schedule, with no interest in waiting for optimal conditions, already decided about himself. Dr. Yoon had told her at the 36-week appointment that everything was positioned correctly, that the previous losses had informed a monitoring protocol that had been, in Yoon's words, thorough to the point of comprehensive, and that there was no clinical reason to anticipate complications. Nia had nodded and thanked her and gone home and sat on the kitchen floor for 20 minutes with her back against the cabinet because the body sometimes needs to be close to the ground. Her mother was in the delivery room. Han was in the waiting area, a fact reported by a nurse with the slightly confused expression of someone trying to categorize a woman in a business suit who had been occupying the same chair for 7 hours working through a legal brief with the focused intensity of someone who has decided that waiting is just another form of preparation. When they put Kofi on her chest, Nia's first sensation was weight. The specific, warm, immediate weight of him, solid and real, in a way that she had not allowed herself to fully imagine across 38 weeks of careful hoping. Her second sensation was sound, the short declarative noise he made, not quite a cry, more like a statement, the sound of someone who has arrived at a destination and is reporting on the fact of the arrival. She put her hand on his back. She felt the rapid, small movement of his breathing. She pressed her cheek against the top of his head, which was warm and damp and smelled like something she had no previous reference for and would never forget, and she let herself be completely in that moment without reaching back or forward, without accounting for how she'd gotten there or organizing what would happen next. Her mother was crying. The specific sound of it, the particular frequency of her mother's crying, which Nia had known her whole life, and which contained in it a whole history of moments both terrible and beautiful, moved through the room, and Nia let it wash over her. "He looks like you," her mother said, her voice thick and rough. "He looks like himself," Nia said. She meant it as the truest thing she could offer. She named him Kofi. No second name, no hyphen, no compromise with the Korean naming convention that had governed 4 years of her life in that house. Her son was Kofi, complete, and she registered it at the municipal office 6 days after he was born with a clarity of intention that the registration clerk received without comment. Min-jae's conviction came 14 months after his arrest. Han called her on a Thursday morning when Nia was at the foundation office reviewing the expanded scholarship panel's final selections. 7 recipients, all women, all in circumstances that didn't have clean definitions. And she stepped out into the hallway and took the call. 22 years. 9 counts. The full weight of what he'd built and what he'd attempted to do with it, measured in years inside a cell in Seoul. His attorneys are filing appeal grounds, Han said, but the grounds are narrow. The evidence record is what it is. How long does the appeal take? 2 to 3 years to exhaust. The conviction stands in the interim. Han paused. It's done, Nia. She leaned against the hallway wall. Through the glass door of the office, she could see Jia at her desk, and through Jia's window, she could see the Seoul skyline in the particular gray-white of an overcast March morning. Everything on the other side of that glass was ordinary and purposeful and hers. "Thank you," she said to Han. "Stop thanking me," Han said. "I build you." Nia laughed. It was brief and genuine, and in the quiet hallway it sounded like something coming back online. She went back into the office. She sat down and picked up the scholarship files and continued where she'd left off, because the work did not stop for verdicts, and she had learned in the past 14 months that this was one of the true things about it, that the work that matters keeps asking for your attention, regardless of what else is happening, and that the asking is itself a form of steadiness you can lean on. 6 months after Kofi was born, she went to Jeju. She left him with her mother in the Mapo apartment. Her mother had not gone back to Lagos, had arrived with 1 suitcase and stayed, gradually migrating her life across the distance and shipments and phone calls until it became simply the case that she lived in Seoul now with her daughter and her grandson, in an arrangement no one had formally proposed and everyone had accepted, and she flew south alone on a clear October morning. She rented a car at the airport and drove the coastal road. The same road. The specific road that had been chosen for her because she drove it at night, and it was plausible. She drove it in the morning now, in full daylight, with the sea visible and steady to her left, and the sky a particular shade of blue that belonged to October on that island and nowhere else. She drove it at the speed of someone who had nowhere to be and was not running from anything, and she felt the road under her and the car around her and the air coming through the window. She'd cracked 2 inches, and she was entirely present in all of it. She pulled over at a point where the land edged close to the coast. Not a viewpoint. There was no sign, no overlook with a railing and a posted placard. Just a wide gravel shoulder where the road bent near the cliff edge, and you could hear the water below if you stopped and listened for it. She got out. The wind came off the water hard and direct and smelled exactly like itself. Salt and depth, and the particular coldness of the sea in October when the surface temperature has dropped and the air above it carries it. She stood into the wind and let it move against her and looked at the water below. She thought about what this place had been in someone's plan, the plausible location, the scenic route that became a margin note in a murder contract. She thought about how many times she'd driven this road before any of that, how many evenings she'd come out here simply because the drive itself was the point, the motion and the coast, and the hour of being somewhere that asked nothing of her, and how that version of the road still existed underneath the other version, still available, still just a road on a coast. She was reclaiming it. That was the only honest word for what she was doing. She had decided not to let it remain only what someone else had tried to make it, and so she had come back and was standing here in the wind looking at the water until the road became hers again, layered but hers. The wind pushed. She stood in it. After a while, she got back in the car and drove to the house. It was smaller than she remembered, or she was different. She unlocked the front door and went through the rooms slowly, opening windows, letting the October air in through each one. The house was clean. It smelled of nothing, the blankness of a space that has been maintained but not lived in, waiting with the patience of structures for whoever was going to occupy it next. She walked through the bedroom and the back porch and the kitchen with its eastward window, and she opened each curtain and each window and stood in each room for a moment, not measuring it, not cataloging what needed to change, just being in it, extending herself into the space and letting the space receive her. She sat on the back porch in the afternoon. The sea was gray-green and the surface of it was moving in small, unorganized patterns, wind-driven, the kind of water that isn't going anywhere particular but is fully in motion, committed entirely to the act of being in motion. She watched it for a long time. She let herself feel the full accumulated weight of everything that had preceded this moment, the hallway, the recordings, Han's car, Lee's conference room, the testimony, the legal months, the apartment in Mapo, the delivery room, the Thursday morning phone call from Han. All of it, laid out in sequence, which she almost never did because in sequence it was very large. She let it be large. She held the full size of it and breathed in the sea air and sat in a chair on the back porch of a house she had taken back from a plan that had tried to repurpose it against her, and she let herself feel what it cost, what all of it had cost. Not just the danger was almost the least of it, in retrospect, because the danger had at least been something she could act against. The cost that sat heaviest was the years. The 4 years inside a reality she hadn't fully known she was living in. The grief of those years which had been real, compounded by the layer beneath it that she hadn't been able to see. The way her grief had been calculated into someone's timeline, factored in as an asset, used. She had loved him. She had been wrong about him. Both of those things were true, and they would both remain true for the rest of her life, sitting side by side in the part of her history that doesn't get rewritten. She was not going to let them be the most important true things about her. She sat until the light changed, until the gray of the water deepened, and the sky went from blue to something cooler, the specific palette of a coastal evening when the warmth has left and what remains is clarity. The kind of clarity you can only see when the softening light of day is gone and everything shows its actual color. She picked up her phone. She called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring, and in the background Nia heard Kofi, 6 months old and entirely committed to the business of making himself heard. His sounds not yet words but carrying the full weight of intention, the emphatic and specific urgency of someone who is absolutely certain that what they are communicating is important. "He's been talking all afternoon," her mother said, warmth running through every word. "Tell him I'll be home day after tomorrow," Nia said. "You tell him yourself." She heard her mother hold the phone toward him, heard the handling of it. Then his sounds filled the line, the declarative syllables, the absolute unself-conscious conviction of a 6-month-old who has decided that the world is his to address and has not yet encountered any evidence to the contrary. And she sat on the back porch with the sea behind her and the October cold settling into her coat, and she laughed. It came from somewhere low and real and surprised itself, the way laughter does when it's genuine, when it doesn't know it's coming and arrives anyway, because something is actually funny or actually good, or because your body needs to make a sound that isn't holding anything back. She laughed at her son talking to a phone he couldn't see, and the sound of it went out over the back porch and into the evening air and dissipated into the wind coming off the water, and the sea did not register it, and the house did not register it, and none of that mattered because she had made the sound and it was real and it was hers. "Okay," she said when she could breathe. "I hear you. I'm coming." Her mother came back on the line. "He's pleased." "He should be," Nia said. "Tell him I said so." She sat a while longer after she hung up, looking at the water in the gathering dark. She thought about what Dr. Yoon had said after Kofi was born. Not a medical observation, just something said almost to herself as she was making a note in the file. Your body held on. Simple and true, in the way that simple, true things are, the kind of statement that doesn't need elaboration because it contains everything already. Her body had held on. Across 3 losses and a marriage that was also a fraud, and 4 days of the most acute sustained danger she'd known, and 38 weeks of the most carefully monitored hope. Held on. Not gracefully, not without cost, but with the kind of stubborn biological insistence that doesn't know how to calculate odds, and so doesn't bother. She stood up from the porch chair. She went inside and moved through the house one more time, closing the windows she'd opened, each one, in sequence, not rushing, feeling the latch of each one click into place. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the east window where the morning light would come in, at the angle she already knew, turning the counter gold for 20 minutes before moving on. She turned off the lights. She locked the front door. She got in the rental car and drove back along the coastal road, south to north, in the dark now, with the headlights making the road immediate and the sea audible but invisible to her left. She drove it without fear, not because fear was irrational, but because fear had been correct when it was needed, and she had used it correctly and it had done its job. And now the road was just a road, a coastal road at night on a southern island, dark and particular and entirely ordinary. At the airport, she sat by her gate with her coat in her lap and her phone in her hand, and the particular emptied-out piece of someone who has spent a day doing something that needed doing and has finished it. She watched the other travelers, the couples, the families, the single travelers with headphones and carefully arranged indifference. And she felt curious about them, which was something she'd stopped feeling for a while and had slowly gotten back. The small, generous curiosity about other people's lives that you lose when your own life has become the only thing requiring your full attention. She was getting it back. In increments, the way most things came back. Not all at once, not as a declared restoration, but as a slow return of ordinary capacity, one small thing at a time. The boarding call came. She stood. She gathered her coat and her bag and walked to the gate and handed her boarding pass to the attendant, and just before she stepped through, she reached into her coat pocket, the same coat, the same deep interior pocket, and pressed her hand flat against the lining. Empty. The ultrasound image was in the Mapo apartment, in a frame above Kofi's crib, where she'd put it when he was 3 weeks old. She'd stood back and looked at it in the frame and thought, this is where this belongs. Here where you can see it. Here where it means what it actually is, instead of what it had to be for a while. She stepped through the gate. She walked down the jetway and found her window seat and buckled in, and when the plane lifted and banked north, she looked down at the island below, the dark shape of it against the darker water, the coastal road invisible but traceable by memory, the specific point where she'd stopped and stood in the wind already behind her now and receding, and she watched it until the cloud cover came and made it disappear. Then she looked forward. The ordinary interior of a plane in motion, the seat back in front of her, the steady hum of the engines, consistent and reliable, doing exactly what they were made to do. The flight attendant moving down the aisle toward her with the beverage cart, making eye contact with each passenger in the practiced, genuine way of someone who has decided that even at 30,000 feet and on the 10,000th repetition, the person in front of you is still worth looking at. She reached Nia's row. Something to drink? Water, Nia said. Please. She poured it. She handed it over. She moved on. Nia drank the water. She looked out the window at the clouds, and beyond the clouds, the darkness where the sea was. And she felt soul getting closer, the way you feel a place getting closer before you can see it. Some shift in your internal compass, some adjustment of the self that happens when you are returning to the place where your life actually is. Her life was there, in 3 rooms in Mapo, in a foundation office with a morning's worth of scholarship files on the desk, in her mother's kitchen noise and Jia's relentless organized efficiency, and Han's clipped phone calls, and Dr. Yoon's steady voice saying, your body held on, in a 6-month-old boy who talked to phones he couldn't see and was pleased with himself for it and should be, Absolutely should be, because he had arrived in the world against considerable odds and with no awareness of the odds, which was exactly the right way to arrive. She had not emerged from any of this clean. There was no clean. There was the version of herself on the other side of it who had been changed by it in ways she would be living with for the rest of her life. Some of those ways difficult, some of them harder to name. The difficulty was real. She was not going to arrange it into something it wasn't, but she was sitting on a plane going home. She had a home to go to. She had built it herself, in 3 rooms and a foundation office and a slowly filling bookshelf and the particular 20 minutes of morning light on a kitchen counter, one choice at a time after everything else was gone. That was the shape of it. Not heroic, she had done what survival required, which is not the same thing as heroism, which is not the same thing as strength, all of which people would call it, and none of which would be quite right. She had done what the situation asked of her, one step at a time, without a complete picture of where the steps were leading, without certainty that any of it would work, in the sustained fear and sustained focus of someone who had something that mattered and was not going to let it go. She had not let it go. The plane began its descent. Through the window, the clouds broke and Seoul appeared below. The Han River catching the city lights, the grid of streets, the concentrated living density of 10 million people going about their Thursday night. And she looked at it and felt the uncomplicated recognition of a person arriving at a place that is theirs. Not because it was perfect, not because it had been easy or would be easy, or because the city below held only good things for her, because she had chosen it, in full knowledge of what it had cost her, and the choice was hers, and she was standing in it. The wheels met the runway with the particular controlled impact of a landing that has gone correctly. She was home. She gathered her coat from the overhead bin. She walked up the jetway with the other passengers, anonymous in the crowd, one person among several hundred in motion through a large lit space, going where they were going. She cleared the gate and followed the signs toward arrivals, and did not hurry because there was no hurry, and her mother had the evening handled, and Kofi was where he was supposed to be. She came through the arrivals door and into the main terminal and stopped for a moment on the threshold, not because she needed to collect herself, but because she wanted to stand there for exactly 1 second and feel the full specific reality of it. She was here. She had made it here. Everything that had tried to make that impossible had failed. She breathed in. She walked into the terminal. She walked toward the exit, toward the city outside the glass doors, toward the car that was waiting, toward the apartment, and her mother's cooking smell, and the specific sound of her son deciding to communicate with the world, toward all of it, the ordinary and the imperfect and the real and the hers. And she did not look back.